Grab your cleats and your constitutional law books. We're diving into the transatlantic turf war over women's sports. Hey folks, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the show that reads legislation so you don't have to. And we add a dash of British court drama for flavor. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Stephen, your resident policy wonk with strong opinions about judicial wigs and swimming scholarships.
Today's episode, Two Nations, One Debate, we're diving into the tangled and politically charged, emotionally exhausting world of who gets to compete in women's sports.
Absolutely. It's a story about Title IX, the UK's Equality Act, and a whole lot of legislative energy on both sides of the Atlantic focused on one of the most controversial social issues of our time.
Before we get into things, let's just talk a little bit about women's sports. And I think I should probably start because I'm a woman and I used to play sports.
And I never did. So yes, please go ahead.
When I was growing up, I was a pretty intense athlete. I'm from the mountains in Colorado. My parents were super sporty, really into sports. Essentially anything that was available, I was in. And my two main sports by the time I got to high school were rugby, which is a team sport, and competitive skiing, which is an individual sport, but you train with a team. And so it's kind of an interesting way to see sports back then. This was in the earlier 2000s. But, you know, with my rugby team, that was all women. It was women's rugby. We were actually really, really good at rugby. My high school, I think, hasn't lost states since 2008. And we went to nationals when I played. And in rugby, there's a lot of people who are very, very strong, very, very fast, and very high performance athletes. Rugby, I think, is one of the most high performance athletes team sports. Freestyle skiing is very different. It is a type of skiing where you ski the bumps and then you go off jumps and then you ski more bumps and then you go off a jump and then you go down more. And you're graded on how fast you go, how good your form is, and how complicated your trick is. And so it was really interesting because I trained with men and I didn't have very many women on my team. I think I only had maybe 4 or 5, and then everybody else was a boy. And okay. I think it really pushed me to be a lot better.
But how would you have felt if there was a trans woman on the team?
I think freestyle skiing is something that I think is a really interesting thing to look at with this, because the very best women's freestyle skier in the world is not as good as probably the top men. And a lot of that has to do with biology and how muscles work and all those other things. And it is interesting when you also talk about something like freestyle skiing. It's a really high performance, high dedication sport. It's kind of like gymnastics. If you think about how intense people are with it, invested in going for this dream of skiing in the Olympics. I was in very high performance sports in high school, and I would have had a hard time because you're spending tons of your life. I probably skied 5 days a week. I went to a school that let me leave school early to go train. Like, I was an elite athlete. So it was something where I think this is an issue that is really difficult when you're talking about really high performance sports. I think the general gist of a lot of what happens with sports and a lot of the reasons that I hate this conversation in general is that because I played sports, I became a much better person. I learned how to share. I learned how to work together. I learned all of these amazing skills that help me every day as a professional. And I also made great friends, and I had a really awesome sense of belonging, and I filled my time with something that was constructive and healthy. And so I hate this debate. I hate that we're here. It's honestly, it makes me sad because nothing seems fair when it comes to especially really intense sports, because just because you're trans doesn't mean that you shouldn't have the opportunity to pursue a sport that you love and have those goals. But also, you know, there is like definitely a biological factor of, you know, the boys on my ski team were way better than me, you know. It's complicated.
It is. It's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think we could just get into it, because I think this is kind of the crux of the issue. Is it's kind of a debate nobody wants to have, but we're all having, and there's not really a way that makes it feel equitable. So I guess let's start in my own backyard. So, H.R. 28 is the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act of 2025, our issue voter bill of the month. What's this bill say, and why is everybody yelling?
Well, HR 28 amends Title 9. So, Title 9, as I'm sure people know, is the landmark civil rights law from 1972 that prohibits sex based discrimination in federally funded education programs, which includes sports. And so it's become one of those laws that has been widely applied to different types of sport and access to sports, really. So, the bill defines sex based only on reproductive biology and genetics at birth. So, the translation of this under HR 28, trans women and girls, people assigned male at birth, cannot participate on athletic teams designed for females. So there's an exception for practicing with teams, but not if it displaces sort of cisgender girls from opportunities or scholarships.
So it's a biologically based definition of sex and not gender identity, and that's kind of the crux.
Yes, exactly. So it's a direct legislative response to concerns about trans inclusion in women's sports, as we've already discussed. So supporters say it's about preserving fairness, and opponents say it's exclusionary and lacks the necessary scientific nuance for an issue that's as complex as this.
Right. And it is very complex when you kind of get into the biology of everything. So the House passed it back in January by a narrow 218 to 206 vote. And that's honestly pretty tight. So what's leading this charge?
So you've got Representative Greg Stube of Florida. Now, he's no stranger to headline grabbing bills, and he's the sponsor. He called it a stand for fundamental truth. And the Education and Workforce Committee chairman, Tim Walberg, said Title 9 is under a direct assault from the radical left.
That is not subtle.
No, it's not remote. So they argue it's about protecting girls from losing scholarships, spots on teams, or getting edged out in competition altogether.
But the opposition brought the heat, too. I saw that Senator Dick Durbin's comments were making it kind of personal.
Yes, he did really. And it's sort of gone quite viral on social media, the things he said. So he asked lawmakers to put themselves in the shoes of families with trans kids and say, how would you feel if your kids were excluded from sport at school? He also pointed out that there are fewer than 10 trans athletes currently competing at the collegiate level out of about 500,000 kids who are competing. So his point is that this crisis is much more political than practical.
Yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And the ACLU called the bill a solution in search for a problem. It seems like we're covering a lot of legislation like that right now.
Yes, absolutely. So their senior counsel, Louise Melling, said it lacked scientific backing and only served to marginalize a group that's already very vulnerable.
Let's hop across the Atlantic, no passport required, and talk about Britain. In April, the UK Supreme Court issued a ruling that defined a woman under the Equality Act as someone born female. What's that backstory?
Yes, so this has been a very, very long-running story over here with all sorts of celebrities wading in and a lot of coverage. And it's the culmination of a legal battle that started in Scotland. So it's between the Scottish government and a women's right groups called For Women Scotland. And the fight was over whether trans women with a gender recognition certificate, so this is they have formally had their new gender recognised, could be counted as women for certain types of legal protections.
Spoiler alert, the court said nope.
Yes, that's correct. It sent a shockwave really through the country and through this debate. The UK Supreme Court unanimously ruled that for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010, which is our key bit of equality legislation, sex means biological sex, not acquired gender. So trans women are legally recognised in many contexts, but not for sex-based protections like women-only spaces or sports.
And this wasn't Parliament. We're talking judges in robes.
Yes, absolutely. Very traditional robes at that, as you might expect. No, so our Supreme Court, very different from the American Supreme Court, I think, in that it is not a controversial body by and large. Ever so often something pops up that's a bit controversial, but most of the time it's all fairly sort of standard legal stuff that doesn't interest people much. And it is apolitical by design, so the judges aren't appointed by like political people at all. So they are just very, very senior judges, and they don't take any part in politics. And the ruling came from Lord Hodge. So our very senior judges are also lords. They're known as the Law Lords. And yes, it's great. He emphasized that trans people still enjoy protections just under the separate category in the Equality Act of gender reassignment. So the way the Equality Act works, it has these different characteristics that are protected, and gender identity is a protected characteristic. So it's not saying that people who are trans aren't going to be protected in any way. They just can't be protected as the sort of the sex definition part of it.
Interesting. Okay, so back to sport, both HR 28 and the UK ruling take a biological stance on eligibility, which kind of seems like where we're getting to with a lot of this. But then there are a lot of implications, right?
Yes, and they're very different. I mean, the reason we're talking about them is because they're both sort of happening at the same time, really, and obviously on the same topic, but they do have quite different implications. So, of course, HR 28 is legislative, so it rewrites how sort of Title IX would be enforced, and that would mean that every federally funded school in the US would have to comply, from sort of elementary PE classes all the way through to NCAA programs. In the UK, though, the ruling clarifies how existing law should be interpreted, and the implementation of that is still very, very local. So schools, for example, are now being told that trans girls shouldn't use girls' changing rooms or toilets. And there's going to be a lot more of that kind of stuff coming out over the coming months.
Yikes. This is a really tough place to navigate.
The biggest impact might be on grassroots sports. So Dr. Seema Patel, who is a sports law scholar in the UK, she warns that there's still a lot we don't know. So it'll depend on how much guidance and support the government offers, and there's still a lot to work through from this ruling.
Let's also talk athletes, and I opened this up talking about myself as an athlete, and I think a lot of the conversations that are around athletes who talk a lot, especially in the US, are people who wouldn't be winning anyways. And so that's something that it's really interesting, because the loudest people in the room are often not the ones that are getting the first place ribbon taken from them. And I do think that's something that is worth looking into when we're talking about how pervasive this is or how unfair it is. And you asked me earlier how I would feel if I was competing against a trans woman. And I guess if I was, always contending for a top 3 spot and somebody was always taking that, then I would probably feel some way about it. But if we're competing for 14th and 15th, come on in, So let's talk about Paula Scanlon, who swam at UPenn with Leah Thomas and is a big supporter of HR 28. She testified that the experience made her feel uncomfortable and unfairly treated.
Yes, and she has become a central figure for supporters of this bill. But the civil rights group like the Human Rights Campaign argue that policies like HR 28 erase the dignity, identity of sort of trans, non-binary and intersex people. So, as you say, it's really, really tricky. I mean, I can sort of sympathize with an athlete who feels they're being unfairly treated. And they're in a lot of ways, the fact that they're not top 1, 2, or 3 in their particular field doesn't really matter, does it? It's every single individual race you want to know deep down that it's completely fair and that you win and lose purely on merit. And so if there is anything that makes you feel that's not the case, you can understand that people would be upset about it.
Yeah. And I mean, that part I think I understand a decent amount, but also people are just generally more gifted for different sports because of their biology, whether they were assigned female or male at birth or anything like that. I'm really short, so I might be a better gymnast. I'm not going to be as good at basketball. To an extent, I think that a lot of this even gets into people are going to be better at different things no matter if you're not contending for the very best slot and you're arguing about somebody else's biology making them better. Everybody else who's above you is also better because of their biology. It's just that they also happen to be a female assigned at birth. To me, it is hard. And I think it does change when you're at different levels of sport. And to me, one of the biggest issues for this bill is that thinking of an elementary school kid not being able to play sport or not being able to participate in PE in a way that doesn't feel very othering is really detrimental. And we want to protect and lift up kids. And this is something where a lot of kids that are having a really hard time are being systematically shoved down and othered. Yeah. And in something like PE class, that's crazy.
I know.
And Yeah. So
And then that is completely, it's very different, isn't it? You need a very clear divide between sport at schools and competitive sport, particularly at a reasonably high level, because absolutely there shouldn't be any difference in PE class or anything like that. That sort of stuff's crazy. But it just illustrates how complex this whole thing is. And in fact, how the science can often appear to be split on this as well. For example, you've got the American College of Pediatricians, they support biological definitions for sport, while the American Academy of Pediatrics favors more individualized evidence-based assessment. So you might think, oh, well, there you go. Scientists don't actually agree on this. But when you look at it, you see that the American College of Pediatricians is actually a conservative advocacy group, and they're not a scientific body per se. And I'm sure that the polarity between the names of these is entirely coincidental, and they wouldn't want any think that they represent all pediatricians in any way.
Yes, I'm sure they wouldn't want organizations to be confused. And elite level sports are also shifting too. What's happening at the top?
Yes, yeah, and this is where it really, really does matter, of course, because this is where those split-second sort of differences between men and women really come into account. And so many international and national federations, particularly swimming and cycling and so on, have already banned trans women from women's categories. And British Triathlon have even gone further, and they created an open category for trans athletes.
That's like a sports version of a third-party candidate, kind of.
So yeah, except with fewer campaign buttons and more likely. But it does raise equality questions and equity questions here as well. So is an open category truly inclusive, or is it just a polite way of sidelining people?
Right. And then there's also a social piece here. So Natalie Washington from Football vs. Transphobia warns that trans people may now avoid sport altogether, which honestly, thinking about how my sports history was, and if I was constantly being ridiculed or asked or othered, I too would not be having the amazing experience that it was to participate on a sports team growing up.
Yes, yes, right. And this is a problem with women's sports in particular. There's a lot of girls who feel very self-conscious and don't want to participate in sports anyway. So the last thing you want to do is be putting anybody off. So she does argue that we risk discouraging participation or isolating people who are already facing discrimination. That's so obviously something that no one wants to do.
Absolutely. So HR 28 passed the House. But what's the future for it in the Senate?
Well, that's unclear. So Republicans obviously have a 53-47 majority in the Senate, but without 60 votes, they so far haven't managed to actually break the filibuster. So it does look like this bill, again, isn't going to go anywhere and will end up just as this sort of symbolic stand rather than an actual major change to the law. Unless, of course, there's a major shift in support and they can actually put it forward again. But it is worth, though, looking at what the states are doing here, because there are lots of similar bills to this passing at state level. So individual states are sort of imposing these kinds of bans.
Yeah. And what about the UK?
Well, we'll see how this ruling trickles down, really. It's likely to spark a lot of new guidance. There's already been a few pieces of guidance that have come out, maybe even new legislation, but the process obviously moves pretty slowly.
Okay. Well, that was a lot. Sports courts, Congress, and controversy. Anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, just this really, whether it's HR 28 or the Equality Act, both debates ask the same question. So how do we balance inclusion with fairness? And no matter where you land, it's clear that we're defining more than just teams and trophies. We're redefining identity, rights, and how we all coexist.
Mic drop. Well, that's all for this month's Issue Voter Bill of the Month. And you can read the full analysis at Issue Voter and track every bill over at BillTrack50.com.
Yep. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to keep looking beyond the bill number.